This is the roundtable portion of our discussion. We welcome your questions. We will be able to see them now, so as you ask them, we can incorporate them and answer them as we go. As I said before, first I'm supposed to tell you that we have a next winner of this handy dandy wine cup, which is empty. I'll note the one here, and that is HR Barb. And so congratulations, HR Barb. Hopefully there's only one of you with that name out there, but you are the winner, so good job. All right, now we're gonna spend however much time we need to of the next hour and a half talking about COVID. Woohoo! And so we're going to start out, but if we finish what we have to talk about and we don't have more questions from you folks, then we're going to transition into all the other questions that we've gotten that are non-COVID related, and we have a super fun game that Karen put together for us to do that. So before we do that, let's take a deep breath, and here we go with COVID. As you know, there are how many standards? I think 4 standards now that you're all dealing with, depending on what kind of employer you are and whether you're covered by one or more of them. There is the federal contractor mandate. There is the ETS, which of course is primary in everybody's mind right now. There's the Maine healthcare mandate from Governor Mills, and there is the federal CMS mandate. So we're all going to talk about one of those just briefly to make sure that you understand that there are 4 separate things that might apply to you, and that you're applying any of the things that that do apply. Just briefly, and it's hard to address any of this briefly, but when we were putting together what we were going to do today, the ETS obviously became front and foremost of what we were going to be talking about and helping you figure out how to apply all of the provisions of it. And now everything has changed. And so, as I'm sure that you know, in some way or another, the ETS is currently on hold. And so what happened was it was challenged in a variety of courts. The Fifth Circuit had addressed it late last week and issued an order indicating, as Josh had mentioned before, that they were temporarily halting it. Well, I don't know what all the terminology is, but eventually it became an order to stay the ETS. OSHA then issued its own statement as of November 12, saying that it was putting it on hold. It was not going to be enforcing it. That raises some confusion. Well, so at this point, a separate district court, federal district court, has been appointed. It's now the Sixth Circuit, which will be hearing the arguments. They're trying to streamline it, but of course there's a lot to this, and so nobody knows what the time frame is, or at least I don't know what the time frame is. Eventually it will likely end up at the U.S. Supreme Court, so we don't know what's going to happen with the ETS and whether you will ever have to enforce it. But the question, of course, is we have deadlines coming up under it in the event that they did reinstate it, and because the first one is December 6th, and then you've got another deadline, January 4. And so there's been some discussion about, well, do we go forward with the things that we were supposed to do so we're ready in the event they undo the stay, or do we not do anything? And so that's one of the things we're going to touch on. But that's generally the status of the ETS. So while it did seem to be one of our primary areas of discussion, it's not really going to be that now. So now each one of the rest of us is going to talk about one of these other standards just to make sure that you understand what all these are, and then we'll talk about how they apply and other COVID things generally. So we're going to start out with, let's start with Brent, and I believe Brent was going to be talking about, I lost my little list here. You were going to be talking about the federal contractor mandate, right?
I thought I was going to talk about the Denver Broncos.
Yeah, we don't want to hear about the Broncos.
Before we start with that, I would just like to say that the 4 of us are all fully vaccinated, so we may take off our masks so you can actually see who is speaking,
right,
and so that you can actually understand what we're saying. So
the unveiling.
That is why we're doing this. And
I've had my booster even, so there you go.
Wow, good for you.
All right. I'm just, there's not even close to enough time, nor would there make much sense to go into details about the
And the Broncos.
federal, well, no, that would make sense. But,
We don't want to hear about the Broncos.
Okay. No. But it wouldn't, can't really get into the details of the guidance for federal contractors and subcontractors, but I'll just try and give a little overview of where things stand now. There are some court challenges to this as well. I'm not sure what progress they've made. They're different because this is generated by an executive order of the president, and the executive order is not very long. It's well, you can, and it's, read it for yourself, about 4 pages long. But of course, it itself then generates among the agencies and the enforcement mechanism much longer documents, but it's contractual, whereas the OSHA tried by federal regulation to say, by regulation, here's what certain employers have to do and how they do it. This is contractual, and it's more like, well, if you want money from the federal government and by selling it goods and services, then there's already a lot of clauses in federal contracts that the federal contractor has to abide by. And now there's going to be another clause. And in fact, it is called the clause in this stuff. And the clause simply in federal contracts as, and there's a timeline. Obviously, this clause wasn't in the contracts prior to the executive order, which was issued in September. And then further guidance was issued later. So this clause wasn't in it yet, but the clause just simply says that the contractor or subcontractor shall, for the duration of the contract, comply with all guidance for contractor or subcontractor workplace locations published by the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, the task force. And here's the guidance, and it itself is not very long. It's got some definitions to begin with, and then it sort of summarizes what it is. And then it provides links to other materials that then flesh out much more by question and answer what things will be, what the clause really imposes in these contracts on federal contractors. And the clause is supposed to be in any contract that's covered by the order that is awarded on or after November 14th, the clause is supposed to be in there. And so if anyone, today's the 18th? If you're an employer and you get awarded a federal contract or enter into a renewal of one, as of today, the clause is supposed to be in there. Presumably the agency with which you're contracting with is supposed to have it in there. Prior to today, it was optional, but highly encouraged if the agency could get its act together to put it in there. One thing about this is that this obviously applies to large federal procurement contracts that go through what's called the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And if your company is one of those, I'm sure you're familiar with the Federal Acquisition Regulations, FAR. And even then, it's only contracts in excess of $250,000 by my reading, because there's a reference to a minimum threshold, and apparently that threshold by statute is now $250,000. But the executive order says but all federal agencies are strongly encouraged to include the clause in any contracts anyway. So it is quite possible that even contracts that are not mandatory in terms of covered by these federal contractor guidelines and the executive order, even if it's not within that, a particular agency might follow the strong encouragement in the executive order and put the clause in there. So, so for example, one example is if you're a subcontractor who just provides products and that's it, under the executive order, it doesn't apply to you. But you could face a situation where for whatever reason, the federal agency with whom the prime contractor contracts says, well, no, you're going to have to include that in all your subcontracts, even if they provide products. I know that we're not required to do that by executive order, but that's what we're doing. It's way too early, I think, to see how that's going to play out. So basically, what they do is they define contracts very broadly. It's clear on its face that it applies to both federal procurement contracts that go through this FAR process regulations, but also to non-FAR contracts. And as I read it, even for the non-FAR contracts, they still have to be 250 grand to be covered. But you'll know because the clause will be in the contract. And if the clause is in the contract, in some ways it makes no difference whether or not it really is a contract within the meaning of the executive order or not, because all the agencies have the discretion to stick the clause in there anyway. And if you don't like the clause, then don't do business with the government, I think would be the attitude if they put it in there. What you need to do if you're subject to the clause, then that becomes a covered contract. You're a covered contractor. You have to identify your covered contractor employees. And that means any employee working on or in connection with the covered contract or working at a covered contractor workplace. And a covered contractor workplace is defined as basically any workplace under the control of the contractor where even if there are people who are not working on the government contract or in connection with it, if other people just happen to come in there or are likely to be expected to be in there, then the contractor has to take steps to enforce certain protocols with respect to them. The deadline, at least for now, for vaccination of covered contractor employees is January 18th, 2022. Obviously, mandatory vaccination of such employees is a big part of this, of the clause. There is an out if a federal agency has an urgent mission critical need for a covered contractor to have employees working, February 2022 and they haven't all been vaccinated yet, the contractor can apply to the agency and they can get an exemption for that. But in addition to the vaccination requirement, I might add that there is no, under these, under the order, there is no testing alternative. But there is the religious and medical contraindication and disability exceptions that for employees. But there is not a testing alternative as there was in the ETS. But there's also requirements relating to masking and physical distancing in the covered contractor workplaces. And they in turn refer you to the CDC's publication as to which county by county are places in the United States with high down to moderate transmission and low transmission and so forth. I went and looked, and not surprising, Maine right now is in the high transmission everywhere. So under these guidelines, everybody would have to, vaccinated or unvaccinated, would have to wear a mask in the workplace. Unvaccinated folks would also have to socially distance, but the vaccinated people don't have to socially distance. Don't ask me why, but that's in here. The employees have to show or provide the contractor with a list of their vaccination status. The contractor also has to designate a particular person or persons to be in charge of making sure the contractor follows these things. The only other couple of things I'll mention is the contractor is required then to flow it down to the subcontractor, and the subcontractor is required to flow it down to the subcontractor. But the right now, at least, they're saying that in terms of enforcement, as long as the contractor is making a good faith effort to do it, they're not going to just come in and terminate the contract. As of now, even if this is still in effect in the beginning of the year, they come in, the stated protocols, they try to work with the employer to see if they can help fix it, get things going again, and termination of the contract is last resort, but of course is on the table if the contractor continually fails to comply or for some reason just can't comply. So that's a little overview.
All right, super. All right, now we're going to shift gears completely, and we're going to go to the state regulation under DHHS for healthcare, and John's going to address that.
Yes, and I'll keep it fairly short because I know that Josh had mentioned them earlier and discussed them as well. And I just want to tell you that I'm sitting here behind Brent, so I'm having a hard time focusing with the ponytail. It's quite something.
I know.
Especially when it's purple.
I know it's going to be very distracting. So, at any rate, so the DHH regulations came out and they've been amended. This is in the Code of Maine Regulations 10-144, Chapter 264, if you want to look it up. But basically what has been done is that Section 2, immunization is required, has been amended. Except as otherwise required by law, each designated healthcare facility, which is defined in Maine, must require for all employees a certificate of immunization, proof of immunity, or an exemption for measles, mumps, German measles, chickenpox, Hep B, influenza, and now they've added COVID-19. So I did mention there's proof of immunity. Later in the regulations, it says that there is no proof of immunity for COVID-19 or influenza. So sorry about that. The next section is a new section. It provides that, again, except as otherwise part of the law, each EMS organization and dental health practice in Maine must also require, I added the also, for all employees, a certificate of immunization against COVID or documentation of an applicable exemption. So through those, and again, EMS organizations and dental health practices, those are also defined terms. So all of those groups are now required to either show the certificate or have an exemption. Now the exemption is basically in a different statute. In 22 MRSA section 802 provides that a medical exemption is available to employees. They have to basically show that immunization is medically inadvisable. There's no religious exemption. We've talked about that before. And the third exemption under that section deals with Hep B only. So pretty much you're looking at the only exception being medical exemption. Any of those folks, and the deadline for compliance is passed, and DOL is out there supposedly enforcing this, but no chief administrative officer may permit an employee to be in attendance at work without either the certificate or the exemption. Let's see anything else in here. There's also no defined minimum period of danger for influenza, Hep B, or COVID-19. So those are things that take effect right away. I think that's all I wanted to say as the nutshell for the DHS regulations.
All right, and then Josh is going to address, just to complicate things further, the final rule from CMS, which was recently issued. And this is again, now we're back to the federal rule.
Yeah, and I'll be brief on this. I know that we've got a number of healthcare clients, and I know that a lot of them either have their own internal legal departments that have looked at this, or a lot of them have sought outside legal counsel to start looking at this. So I won't beat the dead horse, but the CMS policy, it's a little bit different than the state one that we have in a couple of respects. First of all, it's broader in terms of who is subject to it. So for instance, under the state rule, you know, certain types of ambulatory surgical suites might not be covered by the state rule. They might, but they might not. Whereas they might be covered under the CMS rule, even if they don't fall under the state rule. So for the federal scheme, basically, if you're any sort of healthcare provider that accepts Medicare or Medicaid, if you participate in those programs and you are subject to CMS oversight, then you are subject to this rule. Generally what it requires, and I'm not giving any breaking news away here, is that employees, for the most part, be vaccinated against COVID-19. It does set some deadlines for that to occur. The first dose is supposed to be administered by December 6th, so that's coming up fairly soon. And then the final dose is supposed to be over and completed by January 4th of next year. So keep an eye on those deadlines. Another area where it differs from the state rule is the exemptions that are available. Like the state rule, it does have an exemption for medical issues, whether it's a disability or some form of medical contraindication. But it also has an exemption for sincerely held religious beliefs or practices. So that's something to keep in mind, particularly if you're subject to both rules. Keep in mind that there's a little bit of a difference there. To further complicate things, this is also the subject of some pending litigation. I believe it was just towards the end of last week, 10 states filed a lawsuit in federal court in Missouri to enjoin this rule from going into effect, which means basically stop it until we can get some sort of ruling on it and its legality. It was 10 states. Maine was not one of them. New Hampshire was, and a number of others. And the last I checked, which was last night, so who knows if things have changed, but the last I checked, the federal government had not been served in that suit and had not had an opportunity to respond yet. So nothing has happened in terms of court action in that case. But the states who filed the lawsuit are asking for a fairly quick briefing schedule to get some sort of ruling on an injunction here. That could happen sometime in the next few weeks. And obviously we don't know where the court's going to come out on that. So stay tuned if this potentially applies to you to get the latest updates on whether or not it's going to be going forward.
All right, thank you. So you've heard now between the 4 different provisions that all of the 3, well, the CMS, the ETS, and the federal contractor all recognize a religious exemption, but the main DHHS rule does not. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this issue with religion because I've had a lot of questions about it. I think you folks have as well. So it just so happens also that earlier this month, the EEOC issued an update about addressing what religion means in this context and what you're supposed to do about it. So generally, and I'll enlist the panel here to talk with me about this, but generally Title VII recognizes an exemption for a sincerely held religious belief I know a lot of you have heard about this in the past, have grappled with what does sincerely held mean, and you know that overall, pretty much anything is accepted as long as the employee sincerely believes it, whatever that means. But in this situation, I think in more than almost any other case, sort of topic that we've seen with regard to religion, it does not recognize a, let's get the language here, objections to COVID vaccination that are based on social, political, or personal preferences or non-religious concerns about the possible effects of the vaccine. Those are not religious beliefs, according to the EEOC. So, Brent, I'm going to put you on the spot. How does an employer, what am I supposed to do? If my employee comes to me and says, I don't believe in all this, no one's going to tell me that I have to be vaccinated, and by the way, I have a religion that tells me that I don't have to be. So what am I supposed to do?
Well, it's a quagmire, but I think in accordance with the guidance as well, you are permitted to push back a little bit, and because in what you just said to me, you said a couple of things that are pretty clearly not religious, but then you said, but it's basically against my religion anyway. And I think the employer is permitted to at least ask what religion, what belief, what observance, and how is it in conflict. And if the employee can't do anything more than just say, I don't feel comfortable talking about it, it just is against my religion, it's a sincerely held thing, then this is why we're having a roundtable. I think the employer might well want to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, right. He's a professional or volunteer actor, so he's saying I should.
Did you tell him to look at the screen?
I was trying to be more efficient about it, but
I'm trying to do you all a favor. I'm doing it a ponytail.
Right. Nobody wants to see the ponytail.
Anyway, so I think a more prudent employer would just accept it at face value and move to the next phase of the analysis. When I say more prudent, maybe a more risk-adverse employer, and just move to is there a reasonable accommodation that doesn't impose an undue burden? And if there is, great, fine. Or if then it doesn't really matter if it's sincerely held or not. The guidelines do, and I won't read from them, and do provide some examples of other things you might be able to ask about and whatnot. But it's not a comfortable situation, but it's one that's likely to be happening in the next several months in a way that we've never seen religious requests for accommodations before.
And the EEOC does actually in their guidance point out ways in which you might assess this request in terms of whether or not it's real or not real. And so, for instance, they say, has the employee acted outside the scope of what they're now saying is their religious belief? But keep in mind, you can develop a religion overnight and it still potentially has to be accommodated. Or is the timing suspect? And I think that's the big one, because if I've come to you and said, I'm not comfortable wearing a mask, I don't want to do this, I want to work remote until I don't have to, and you say no, then all of a sudden I say, oh, well, now, by the way, this is against my religion. So the EEOC is recognizing that maybe you can take that into account. Now, the standard for determining a religious accommodation is also different than disability. And Josh, you want to address that a little bit?
Yeah, so the standard in addressing a requested accommodation for religion is whether or not it imposes an undue burden, but it's a different undue burden analysis than what you would deal with in the disability context. And so the question, when you cut to the heart of it, is really whether it would impose more than a de minimis burden or cost on the employer. And that's not necessarily just financial cost, although it can be. It can be operational costs. and other non-financial aspects that they take into consideration. So it's a much lower bar to meet in order to establish an undue burden in the religious context than it is to meet in the disability context. Again, because you're really looking at, is it more than de minimis or a minimal burden on you?
And so and Brett raised this in his discussion, you know, for the medical exemption, you are charged with getting very specific information from an employee's physician to support that exemption. But what about religion? So John, I'm going to put you on the spot since you're my husband and I can. What do you think about saying to the employee, well, I have to have a note from your religious leader that you're not allowed to have this?
I think that you're inviting major trouble because the religious leader may give you a burning bush or something like that. I mean, who knows?
That's why I do not ask him questions.
I would suggest that you not ask for a note from a religious leader. I would suggest that you keep Anne-Marie and the rest of us on speed dial. I think that you can certainly push back a little bit to make sure that it's a real thing and not something that's just designed to circumvent the answer of no, you have to get vaccinated or whatever. But in the end, you need to be very careful, I think, because it takes very little to file a human rights complaint, and it takes a very lot to defend them. And it's probably not worth the time to try to fight it too much.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that. And in fact, the EEOC, along with their guidance, they actually have a religious accommodation request form. So you can get that off the EEOC website. I'm waving it around here, but that's what it looks like. And it actually does go through and asks them to identify it and describe it, and then asks for what they're looking for accommodation. What it does not do is say, have your leader fill this out and confirm your religious belief. So without belaboring the point, we just want to talk about that because there have been a lot of questions. Now, to my wonderful staff over here who's helping with these, I've seen questions pop up and then they go away. Can we list them so that we can actually see them, or? Yes.
And
Okay.
while we're doing that, can I just add to that
Yeah.
last thing? Not only should you not ask for a note for the reasons that they've already said, but even if you were to ask and the employee comes back and says, I wasn't able to get a note from my pastor or whatever, that wouldn't let you off the hook, because the law is fairly clear that somebody may hold a sincerely held religious belief, even if it's not a mainstream belief within their own religion. So for example, let's say you're Catholic and the Pope comes out and says there's absolutely nothing wrong with Catholics getting these vaccines, it is not against our religion. You might be Catholic and you might still be able to meet that standard of showing it's against your personally religious beliefs to take the vaccine, and that would suffice. So just another reason why don't go down the road of asking for notes or anything like that.
The individual might give you a note from themselves saying,
Right.
I'm the right person to ask.
That's right, because they can be a religion of one.
Right.
There's no prohibition on that.
Traditional Protestant, tenets, as I understand it, is, the individual has a relationship, a direct relationship. It's not hierarchical, at least in some traditional Protestant religions. One reason also to call the lawyers when you get this is, if nothing else, we can serve as sort of outside eyes and ears on it to see how it sounds to somebody who, you might sort of have dealings with this employee in the past, or you might look at it a little differently because of the culture of the particular employer, the size or whatnot, and it just might look and smell different, to an outside, observer, where we might be like, you're thinking of what? You're thinking of doing what? And so that's apart from the legal, I guess, certainty, because there's not much legal certainty in these situations.
True enough. All right, so we have one question on the screen about the OSHA ETS, if it goes forward, and I can answer this fairly in short order. do you, where does it? It just
Gone.
disappeared. I'm like reading it and it's gone. Where does the ETS fall in terms of providing or compensating team members for required weekly testing? So it's very clear that while you have to pay up to a certain time period for the vaccination, you do not have to pay for the testing. And the supposition behind that is that it's meant to encourage mandatory vaccination as opposed to testing and masking. So there is no actual requirement that you provide for the testing. Do you have to provide transportation? No, you do not, period. At least as of now. I mean, everything might change when it actually comes back to us. So, all right, so now just
Here's another one, Amory.
Oh, if someone has, can everybody see these, or should everybody can see them? Okay. Someone has asthma and is unable to wear a face mask due to this, and they're not vaccinated, they will still have to test weekly, but what about? So I'm a little bit reticent to answer all the questions based on the ETS, since we have no idea whether it's going to come back at all or what format it's going to come back in. So I think as long as the group agrees, I think specific questions about the ETS maybe we'll hold, and then if it does come back, we'll be ready to tell you all about it. Except that I do want everybody to weigh in. So now you're in a quandary because this exists and now it kind of doesn't exist, but it has deadlines that exist and it's unclear. I mean, presumably they're not going to be enforced as they are now because we may not even have a decision before then. But if I'm an employer, what do? I'm supposed to start this list of all my employees and their vaccination status and take copies of their cards. Do I do that or do I not do that?
Don't take copies of the card. I suggest that you make a list and just check them off and then say you keep your card, so you don't want that kind of record in your possession. That's a place to start.
Well, is this a general question of, it looked like for at least 2 weeks, I was going to be required by law, or at least by OSHA standards, which is a law, to have a pretty full-blown, mandatory vaccination or I could pick alternative where you also would have testing as an alternative, whatnot. Now that that's gone, should I just sort of pretend like it's coming back and start down that road right now anyway, or B, forget about whether it's coming back or not, or just as an employer have my own policy?
That's exactly what I just asked.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what our lawyer does, right?
So now let's answer the question.
Well, okay. We know the question.
All right.
Well, I'm going to give you the answer.
Okay. All right. We're ready.
The answer after. I've come to believe, and this is, the word polarizing is used so often, but it is true. I mean, you can hardly say anything about these things that doesn't at least get somebody riled up. But I'll wear my political allegiance sort of say, I personally think that vaccine mandates are a good thing. But in terms of counseling employers at this point, unless the employer, for whatever reason, has its own real sentiment about this, for whatever reason that might be, I would just not have mandatory testing, mandatory vaccine, any of that stuff until I was required to do it by law.
Okay. So, all right. So now the listing that we were talking about before, that's if you do have the mandatory policy. And the question is, do you want to make the list and show everybody's status? So let's say an employer has already made their own personal decision, regardless of the ETS, that they're going to require vaccinations. Josh, do I have a list? Do I not have a list? Do I want that in any written form?
So if you've got your own voluntary policy requiring vaccinations with all the appropriate exemptions, somebody has to presumably be in charge of verifying that people have complied with your requirement. So that would be somebody in HR, or there should be one delegated person or one team of people, I would say, that would verify vaccination status with employees. You know, the EEOC guidance is fairly good on the fact that getting verification is not prohibited. You're allowed to do that. So I think that's fine for you to do, and you should do if you actually want your policy to be followed. But where I would probably draw the line under a voluntary policy as compared to the OSHA ETS standards is, like John said, I would not take the next step of taking and keeping copies of medical records or vaccination cards at this point. I certainly wouldn't be publicizing any lists. You might have your own internal notes about who's vaccinated and who's not, but I would not let that leave very many people's hands, and I wouldn't be publicizing that and giving that information out because that is arguably confidential medical information. And just from a morale perspective, employees probably wouldn't take too kindly to that being posted on the lunchroom wall. So that's my initial thought on it. And in terms of the standards themselves, in terms of what do we do while things are in limbo, one of the requirements under the ETS is a pretty hefty policy that's in place in terms of how you're going to handle things. So if you have the resources and if you have the time, which I understand not all employers do, it might make sense for you to at least get a policy drafted and in place so that if the ETS goes forward, you have it ready to go. But you don't need to necessarily implement it. You just have it on the back burner, so to speak, so that you've got one step completed if and when the court signs off on the ETS.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense. And if and when you are charged with doing this, you know, I've thought at length about how to maintain the information about the documentation for the vaccination. And I think that because it has to be, because it's a confidential medical record that has to remain confidential, at this point, I'm thinking you would do it like you do I-9s, and you have one binder with your listing of all your employees and copies of all their vaccination status that's kept locked, confidential, with very few people having access to it, as opposed to taking copies of all that stuff and putting them in personnel files where more people would be able to see them. Plus, if that meant if OSHA ever did come in and say, I want to see that you've complied with the ETS, you just pull out one binder, just like with the I-9s, and say, here it all is.
But not to have the actual vaccination cards in that binder, right?
I would have copies of them.
You would?
Well, because the ETS would require it as of now, and so I think if you were, but I agree, for now, I wouldn't do it. But when if you are required to do it, that's the format that I would put it in.
And if there's one thing that COVID has taught everybody is to be flexible, because there will be undoubtedly many changes before the ETS become finalized. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, so now, just to hit on some of the other questions that we seem to get a lot of, suppose I have an employee, and you've seen a million different versions of this, but what if I do have my own policy as an employer and say, I want everybody to mask, and an employee says to me, not going to do it. And they don't raise it as it's not a religious issue, it's just, it falls into the social, political, whatever, you're not going to tell me what to do. What do you do with them?
I'll be the bad guy here. From my perspective, it's useless to have a rule if you're not going to enforce it. So if you go so far to make the decision, we are going to require this. And again, as long as they're not, you know, asking for an exemption and qualified for an exemption, and they're just thumbing their nose at it because that's what they want to do, I would discipline that employee. And if you have a progressive disciplinary program, which I assume most of you do, I would work through that. So you start with a verbal counseling. If they don't get their act together, you move to the next step, which is a written warning or a verbal warning, whatever. And I would just continue through so that your policy actually has teeth and your employees know that you mean what you say.
I would actually add to that it's probably worse than useless to have a policy that's not being applied and enforced uniformly. So it's a difficult thing because, you know, good employees are hard to find these days. But maybe one way of handling it is to put down in the policy exactly what will happen for violations. And it doesn't mean that you can't have some wiggle room in terms of the finalizing the discipline. But if you let them know up front that if you do not come to work wearing a mask, first time you get a written warning, second time you get a suspension, third time you will be dismissed. Then you can just say to them, here's the policy, you know what's going to happen, and it takes a little bit of the pressure off you.
All right, but here's a twist. Plus, I was just thinking, we're going to apply progressive discipline to the child.
That's what I was thinking.
Because it's not working any other way. So we're going to do verbal warning, written warning. I don't know what.
If you're like me, you might have to jump right to loss of TV.
Right. All right, so here's a twist though. That's fine to apply progressive discipline. I completely agree with you. But here I am, employee who refuses, and now I'm on your work site. And the rule is wear a mask. I'm not wearing one. You call me in, you said you're going to get a verbal counseling for not wearing a mask. I say, I don't care, I'm not wearing one. You're not letting me stay there though, right?
No,
because now I'm unmasked and everybody else sees me.
I agree.
I agree
That
with that.
person should be sent home.
So you're going to send them, now what kind of, so then I'm going to say, well, how are you going to pay me? What leave do I get?
None, it's disciplinary.
You get
Really?
unpaid bad employee leave.
What if I have EPL?
If they've got that available, I suppose.
See, now that's
I
interesting
disagree
though.
with that, because I think EPL is, you can take EPL for any reason, so you can take it for sick time and you can take it for vacation time, but a temporary suspension or even a short-term
Disciplinary.
suspension is different.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So if it's
Yeah.
disciplinary and that's why I'm sending you
That's
home
true.
because you refuse to comply, am I entitled? What if I have, vacation time or whatever, EPL?
I mean, an
Not-
employer can decide
Yeah.
to allow that, but I don't think that they're required to, because it is disciplinary in action in
Yeah.
nature, and to allow them to take vacation time, whatever, and get paid for it, it's really,
Kind of defeats the
Yeah,
purpose.
I agree with you. I'm
So-
sold.
So what if your employee comes in and says, all right, not in your face kind of way, not in a nasty way, but just, I really am not going to wear a mask. It's not medical, it's not religious, I'm just not going to wear one. Can I have leave? Can I just take a leave of absence until this whole thing is over? Because I've heard that about 100 times.
I think that the employer,
No,
I think that the employer can consider that if there's a mechanism for extended leave, but the person would probably need to be aware that if you want to take unpaid leave for an unspecified period of time, your job may or may not be here for you when you decide you want to come back. But that makes it easier. You're having an agreement about whether the person is going to be on site or not, and it avoids the whole disciplinary issue. So maybe the employee at that point will just say, maybe this employment's not for me, and then they can separate.
Brent, did you have something to add?
no, I agree.
I was gonna say I'll be the bad guy again. You certainly can do that if that's what you want to do, but if it were me practically, I might be more, if I'm the employer and I understand I'm not, I might be more inclined to say, well, this is the requirement of the job, and if you're telling me you're not gonna do it, then that's your decision to make, but you're gonna have to live with it, and we're gonna find somebody else who will do what we need to do. And for me, I think practically speaking, it's just problematic, if not administratively burdensome, to have people on unspecified status for who knows how long.
Right, and if you do, and I agree in the sense that the employer is permitted to make this, and I won't use the word accommodation, but this, right, for this person. But also, so suppose the employer says, yeah, okay, it's fine, you don't have to come in indefinitely, and then either hire somebody or have somebody else doing that job, and now suddenly things change and the person wants to come back. It's not very fair to the person who's been doing that to say, I mean, the person's been working there to say, okay, you're out now because so-and-so has decided, he or she or they or, it's gotten to the point where it's.
Don't go there.
I won't go there. I'm just saying, it's like, I'm always afraid I'm gonna
We're going to talk about that in the general.
Next question.
Okay,
Yeah.
question.
Well, no, I want to say something to support I'm supporting
Okay.
you. Because I agree that I think what John said is you put them out, but there's no job security. And I would write a very firmly worded email or letter saying, you can be out for, if that's what you want to do, and you can be on this unpaid administrative leave, but your job may not be here. And we're not going to hold it open, and we're going to fill it, because if I didn't need anybody in that job, you wouldn't be employed in the first place. Because it's unlike an accommodation, right? Because if it was because of a medical reason, you'd have to keep my job open, arguably.
And I just wanted to point out that there are a number of public sector employers who may have policies for extended unpaid leave as well. And so in that situation, the employee could come to you and request one. It's probably discretionary whether it's granted, but there's probably a policy that will address it as well.
Well, that's a good point, because what if, I mean, shouldn't they check their policies to see, because a lot of employers do have a handbook policy that says we recognize unpaid administrative leave for whatever reason. And so if you have that, that may apply to this person. And if you don't apply it, then God knows what kind of discrimination claim you might get, right? So I think it's definitely a case-by-case situation.
We have
all right.
2 questions that relate to this.
Good, okay.
So,
Under CMS, what is suggested if a coworker refuses to work with someone who's not vaccinated? Also under CMS, plus the employer pay for. So that's specific to the, I think you had talked about that. Can you address either of those, or do we want to?
I'm gonna hit the pass button.
All right, let me see. I've got some info about the CMS here. I'm not sure, though, that this is really makes a difference whether it's CMS or not. I mean, I don't think, as far as I know, the CMS guidance doesn't say anything about paying for testing. And in fact, it doesn't talk about it because it requires vaccination, right? So testing isn't an option under CMS. And then, so let's talk generally, not just under CMS, but what if a coworker refuses to, so you're not vaccinated, Brent, and I know it, and I'm not going to be around you. And so I go to the employer and say, you have to make him leave or move me to a different area. What do you guys think?
Well, presumably there'll be some other precautions that Brent will be taking, whether it's social distancing, masking, testing, in which case I think the response is get back to work.
Well, I mean, we might work in a situation, you know, we're in the kitchen, you know, cooking, or somewhere, and I'm not vaccinated and you're not comfortable working next to me. And so I guess my first question would be is, on what basis are you not comfortable?
Yeah.
Because if you have some sort of underlying medical condition that could be classified as a disability, then I need to make an accommodation for you, which might be making me go away a little bit. If it's simply because...
Oh, wait, let's complicate that. So let's go with that scenario, but...
God, I'm glad she wasn't my law school professor.
Why my kid hates me. But suppose you have your own medical condition and you can't be vaccinated.
Right, well, back
Does that make it, because now you are entitled to accommodation potentially. I want an accommodation because I don't want to be near you.
Well, if I'm posing a significant risk to your health or safety in the workplace, and that can't be accommodated by a reasonable accommodation, then I'm not eligible for that. So the employer has to get rid of me.
Ooh, but you have a disability and that's why you can't be vaccinated.
Well, same thing though, is that if so if I can't be vaccinated, then, but the question is do I qualify for an exemption? Well, I am disabled, and is it because of my disability that I'm not vaccinated? Okay. So then, is there a reasonable accommodation that eliminates the significant risk? And this is where I think it's brutally difficult for the employer, because when I read the EEOC's guidance this morning, and it talks about significant risk, and it talks about the things that the employer is supposed to look at, you know, individualized assessment based upon the most objective, up-to-date medical evidence and the size of the workforce and yada, yada, yada. It's almost asking the employer to be Dr. Shaw and make these conclusions about what is and is not a significant risk, when even that is significant risk. What does that mean? I mean, I once, years and years ago, I had a case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court where a local dentist believed that it was a significant risk to him to fill the cavity of an HIV positive person in his office. And we spent years and years arguing about what was and is not a significant risk. Is it 1 in 10,000 chance of fatality a significant risk? 1 in 1,000 chance of fatality a significant risk? Under certain many agency guidelines, Food and Drug Administration, whatnot. For example, if 1 in 500,000 people dropped dead if they had an aspirin tablet, that would be deemed a significant risk, even though it's 1 in 500,000. But if the risk of transmission of COVID in the workplace, if you wear a good mask and you socially distance, I don't think anybody knows what the answer to that is. And yet the employer is being asked to sometimes have to try and make some decision based upon their perception of what is and is not will be a significant risk.
If I'm the employer in that situation, I'm going to be pretty reluctant to can the person who can't get the vaccine. And I would think that through some combination of measures, you could probably put together some package that makes things as safe as can be, whether that's masking, testing, sanitation, social distancing, whatever combination might work, I think is probably going to do the trick in terms of the substantial risk thing. And then the question comes back to, okay, well, what do we do about the person who is vaccinated but is not comfortable working around the person who's not vaccinated? And that's when you look to, well, can we move their workstation? What else can we do to accommodate them? But firing somebody would be something that I would be pretty reluctant to do in that scenario.
All right, if you're gonna be reasonable, then I guess you have to take a look at it, depending upon the situation and what the business is and whether there's any way. I mean, from a practical perspective, maybe you don't want to even have that fight. Maybe there's some easy way that you can have these two people not work together, and it might just save you some headache to do it that way, and then say get back to work.
I think I would also go back to the CDC guidance, because that really is the place that I keep coming back to consistently, and look at what that says about what's a safe environment. So if it's saying face masks are recommended and social distancing is continuing to be recommended, and then that's their threshold for safety, then I may decide for the I can't remember who was who anymore, but for the person who said, I don't want to work next to a non-vaccinated person, I think my response might be, well, as long as they're adhering to our rules for non-vaccinated people, which means masking and distancing, then they're meeting the standards. And if you want to move, that could be an option for you, but we're not going to take action against that person who's complying with the policy in the CDC. We have other questions.
A few more.
Okay. Cleanings vendor to medical buildings. Customer wants a copy of our employees' service and vaccination. No. What do you say?
I don't see any problem with a copy of the employees that service them. So if you have a cleaning crew that goes into a building, I want to know who your employees are under the contract.
I'm reading this to say a copy of the employee's vaccination card.
Well, there are commas, so I think the next step is whether you can get a copy of their vaccination card, and then I would agree no to that.
I think you can tell them they're all vaccinated and leave it at that, but I would not produce a copy of the vaccination card.
And to make it interesting is if that medical building falls under the state mandate, they have an obligation to make sure that their vendors and contractors who are coming into the facility are vaccinated. So they are certainly allowed to ask and get verification of it through one mechanism or another.
Okay, if we do not provide religious or medical exemption under CMS, is it considered a termination or we accept a resignation? Does that mean somebody has asked for one of those exemptions and you decline to give it to them for some particular reason? Maybe we could get some follow-up from that person. I'm not clear on, does anybody else want to address it as it is now?
Well, at least under, say, the state regulations, if you're a healthcare provider and the person decides they don't want to get vaccinated and they don't have a medical exemption, at that point, I'm not sure that it matters if it's a termination or resignation. If the person agrees, then they have a resignation, and if they don't, then you terminate them. I think that the impact going forward probably is going to be minimal. They still would have the right to apply for employment.
We've been playing this game though with a lot of employees for some reason in COVID more than any other time I've seen it. And it's almost like this chess game about, are they gonna force me to terminate, or am I gonna call it a resignation? And in fact, we went back and forth with one employee saying, I accept your resignation, and they kept saying, I'm not resigning, but yet I'm not coming to work. And I think it does come down ultimately to unemployment entitlement. But frankly, I think the standards that we were accustomed to seem so far out the window that I don't think there's any way to even gauge whether or not unemployment is going to be awarded. And in fact, it seems likely that it will be in most situations.
If a person refuses to get the vaccine and that's the cause for the separation, is that voluntary? I don't know. Maybe someday we'll find out. So I think we completely avoided that question.
All right, did you say there was another one, or was that it?
Two more.
Okay. Does the burden of costs follow the employer under the main DHHS? I'm not aware of anything in the ruling that requires the employer to pay for that under main DHHS. Do you folks?
No, I think that's an individual requirement, and the vaccination actually is free anyway, so.
Right. And there's no
time.
Do it on your own time.
right.
Unlike the ETS, you don't have to pay for any particular time for them to go get it. Although, I mean, if you apply general wage and hour rules, if you're requiring it and they're going on work time, I think you do have to think through whether or not you're going to compensate them for that time.
Yeah, I think it's likely, I'm going to violate lawyer rule number 1, which is don't think out loud, but if you're requiring it and you're allowing them to go get it while they're on the clock, then my gut reaction would be probably that's going to be compensable time.
Yeah, I think so too.
And it's not such a long period of time,
Right,
really.
right.
Maybe you're just
Work
better off as a practical matter, covering the cost of a few hours. You can get it pretty quickly now,
Right.
it's my experience.
Yeah.
It doesn't take 4 hours or.
Now, the day off you need after the vaccination because you're not feeling well, that's a different question.
And just so everybody knows, none of these rules that we've been talking about address the booster. As far as I know, it's not a piece of what's required by any of these different standards, at least so far.
Correct.
Right.
This is the last one, it's 2-part.
Okay.
Let me know when you're done.
It's a cliffhanger.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
No, I don't think you need to. Is it reasonable for us to have COVID card copies to prove that the person on the work site has either the immunity card or an exemption? I think that you can take that information down and you can have the person even write an affidavit. I personally witnessed this person's card and they have been vaccinated or they have provided or they qualify for medical exemption, and then that's should be the end of the inquiry.
And just to know, that's different under the ETS as it exists now, or in whatever form it is, and it does require them. So we'll see whether that comes out.
And the question asked about immunization, and just to reiterate what John had said earlier, not immunization, excuse me, immunity. The regulations do allow proof of immunity for some diseases, but COVID is not one of them. So you
COVID
can't,
and flu are both
yeah, you
exempted.
can't have somebody come in and say, I'm immune from COVID because I've already had it 3 times and I've got natural antibodies. That's not going to cut the mustard.
You're Rogers defense.
Right. It has to be vaccination for COVID.
Yeah, after the second time you had it, you think you figure that out.
Right.
All right. So this was a clarification of what we were talking about a second ago. They applied and we denied the religious exemption.
My gut reaction to that is if they applied for a religious exemption and you denied it and they resign, and if they're going to make literally a federal case out of it, like a lot of people do, My supposition would be that they would claim that it's a constructive discharge, that they had no choice but to resign, and therefore it's effectively the same thing as firing them.
So the other alternative is what we were talking about before, which is you tell them to get vaccinated. They say they can't for religious reasons. You say no go. And so instead of terminating or having a resignation, maybe you consider at that point putting them out on unpaid whatever leave without holding the job open. Although oddly enough, that could also be considered a form of a reasonable accommodation for the religious exemption. So
It also could be described as a adverse employment action. They don't want to go.
well, right. Yeah.
Just thinking out loud.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so we're at about 12:20, and which means we have a little less than a half an hour to go. So Karen has done a lot of work for us on this.
Thank you, Karen.
Super fun, I mean, just generally, but also, wait do you see this? So I'm gonna,
And while she's bringing that up, it is fair to thank Karen and everyone else who's worked on this backstage, and that's including
absolutely Mark and Eric
Mark and Eric, Brooke, and consultants who I can't remember her name.
Ashley.
So thank you all.
Yes, I agree. All right, now.
You get a spit.
God help me. This is the wheel of questions. And so we're going to spin, and when the number comes up, somehow a question's going to appear on the screen, and then we're going to have to answer it. So this could be fun. All right, I'm going to just call me Vanna. Here I
I
go.
like my vow.
Oh, so.
Number 4. Look at that. What can you give for a reference?
That's
Can
a
you
good one.
be honest if past employees were always late or were not good at their job? I would love to answer this, but I'm gonna open it up to the
You'll have a
panel.
chance.
I would say that you can be honest. I believe that there is a provision somewhere, and I can't put my finger on it, that does provide you immunity from
Sort of immunity.
qualified immunity.
Well,
You get an idle.
It's
Has
a
to
good
be in
faith.
good
You
faith.
get an
It's a
idle.
good faith.
right.
My take on this, and what I've been asked this question, the advice I usually give is, while there is immunity for good faith, I think the best practice is name, rank, and serial number, which is, here's the dates that they worked, here's the position that they worked, and that's it. My rationale being simply, even if you have a good faith immunity defense, there could still be a whole lot of time and expense and headaches involved in proving and succeeding on that defense in a defamation lawsuit or tortious interference lawsuit. So just doing the name, rank, and serial number, I think, is a much easier way to deal with that. And usually,
That sends a message too.
And you should funnel it, all requests for references or something, if you can, should be funneled through one person even, or one office at least, so that other employees, if asked, or at least should understand that they're not to say anything. I mean, it's sort of an age-old question. I mean, 30 years ago, I don't know that many employers would give it a thought, because a lot of even former employees got bad references. But then employers started getting sued for defamation whenever they gave a bad reference, and the cost of that was, very costly. And so he ended up with a system nowadays where I suspect most large employers at least just do name, rank, and serial number.
So here was my immediate thought about this, and I agree with everything everybody said, except that I would wonder if you, employer, have done your job in documenting the problems with this person. Because if the person knew that they had problems with consistently being late or not being good with their job, they ought to know that. They ought to know that that's the situation. And so I would say, well, why are they putting you down as a reference if they know that they were terminated for bad conduct or because they were a bad performing employee? And so that raises, of course, this age-old issue about make sure your performance evaluations are correct and you're bringing up the things that need to be brought up so so people are aware of this. Okay, here we go again.
That's better. Last one was a little.
Want me to give it some more force here? Did I land on 4 again? No, it's on 3. Megan, when is LD 610 effective?
Which one's 610?
I don't have my materials in front of me. It's in that black binder right there if you want to grab
Is
it.
it over here? It's right there.
My recollection is that all of the legislation this year was non-emergency, which means October 18.
610. If this is not emergency,
So October 18.
in other words, it's already in effect.
Okay, here we go. 7. This is fun. With all the legal holidays, do I have to pay for the time off? Should we all do it?
It depends.
Oh,
Well, now you have to explain.
So, it depends on your situation. So do you have a collective bargaining agreement that speaks to that? You might, and if so, you've got to follow whatever the CBA says. Generally speaking, if you don't have a CBA, you don't have to give paid holidays off. People might have paid time off available to them that they elect to use, but generally speaking, you don't have to do that as a matter of course.
I came close to saying this, but then I think I forgot to say it on the new Juneteenth holiday. Let's face it, there is, I'll say, a racial framework to it. So if you're an employer and you give paid time off for all the other legal holidays except for Juneteenth, maybe someday I'll learn how to say that. I'd be a little wary of that,
I agree.
frankly.
I agree completely.
Follow
And
up
you're
on
not
Juneteenth.
required to make any holiday a paid holiday. It's completely up to your personnel policy or your collective bargaining if you've negotiated it. So if you wanted to make New Year's Day a work day, go at it.
Yeah, Scrooge. Well,
And then the
you
follow-up,
say
Brent,
Christmas.
to the Juneteenth.
Right. We are not required to be closed, but no, you're not required to make it a paid holiday.
I understand it's a paid holiday from the state, so state
Right.
employees will get it
Right.
off and paid.
Right.
And there may be, offices that follow the state holiday just because that's the way that they do it in practice, but you're not required to do that.
But I definitely agree with Brent. If you recognize other holidays, such as Indigenous Peoples' Day or even Christmas Day, anything else, you really should consider Juneteenth and what kind of message it's sending if you choose not to recognize that date. Or at least make it one of the floating holidays, potentially, if people still have those. Okay.
Getting better.
I know, right? 9. Oh, I love this. Well, here is one place. I mean, without being flippant, we certainly very often write employee handbooks, but it's expensive, and not a lot of small employers are able to do that right off the bat. I'm a huge proponent of having the minimal in terms of a handbook. And I've had clients who will go online, for instance, and download some big box store's handbook that you can access online and say, look, I must be covered now because they must have, these big lawyers who do all this stuff. And my response to that is that's a terrible idea for a variety of reasons. You have to be very careful about downloading and adopting anything because you may, for instance, be subject to the FMLA or not, and that handbook may say something different, and then you're putting yourself in a real difficult position. And it may not be Maine specific, so there's a lot of reasons why you need to start from scratch, have it apply to you specifically. But at the risk of, sending business elsewhere, I hate to do that, but there are a lot of really good HR consultants out there, and we work with several of them who can do a handbook, and maybe you have it done there initially and reviewed legally just to be sure. And so there are other options for that. But I just caution people about just taking somebody else's and saying, well, I know they do things right most of the time, so I'm just gonna take
And you never
theirs.
know what's up to date too, right?
Right.
Things change fast.
And, a lot of the ones you can find online are from other states, and so Maine might have some different laws than the other state, and they might have laws that we don't have.
Well, there
So,
may be local laws now.
yeah, so,
And so many things vary in accordance with the size of the employer. Sometimes, obviously, also the industry specific.
Okay, all right. Here we go. 6. All right, internal employees apply for another position, we interview them, should the notes from the interview be added to their personnel file?
I don't know the answer, no, but I'm gonna put my 2 cents in and the others correct me. I think the wording of what constitutes a personnel file in our statute is broad enough to encompass this, because it's presumably going to be talking about their capabilities and characteristics in terms of whether they're fit for that particular employment or not.
I was gonna agree.
Really?
I agree.
Right.
Brent and I have worked
That's
together
all
for, what, 22 years now?
You've seen history.
That's all right. Seminar's over.
We have a history of not agreeing, but in this particular case, I completely agree. Does anybody disagree with that?
No, absolutely. And in fact, we've had cases where interview notes for somebody who's not the successful applicant and then later claims it was based on some form of discrimination. Those can, oftentimes be really handy for you to have to show, that they gave some lackluster answers or whatever the case might be. So I would keep them.
I do have one qualification, that even if you don't stick them in their personnel file and they go into some other binder that's not labeled personnel file, when the employee comes in and asks for a copy of their personnel file, it's in it from a metaphysical perspective.
Right.
So,
Right.
Yeah.
I'll say something about that too, a little bit of a hobby horse, because as you know, Maine has a statute that an employee can request personnel file. It's defined functionally. And so through the years, I will have sometimes harp on my client that, it's really unlikely to be just that little skinny manila folder or one little thing that you, in your mind, think of as the personnel file. And even though can be a pain in the behind to have to sort of go around and collect all this other stuff, if the former employee, often it is, has a decent attorney, they'll right away be able to sniff out that the employer did not do a decent job in really giving the personnel file within the meaning of the statute. And that just helps nobody. It doesn't help the employer at all. It just creates more suspicion and likelihood that the plaintiff's attorney will think maybe there's really something here.
I totally agree. And that means if you keep FMLA requests and stuff related to them separately, you go there and you make sure the employee doesn't have anything, because if they do, that's part of the personnel file. It also means the workers' comp information. If they've got a claim, past or current, that's also part of the personnel file. And what's really important is supervisor's notes. So we've all had those situations where a supervisor has a little book, he or she carries it around all the time, they make notes in it, and you've all heard my story about one of my most fun cases for me anyway, not for the employer. Very, very, very high level employer, had 1 billion employees. The CEO calls me up on Friday afternoon and says, I can't stand working with my secretary anymore. She's on the phone all the time and I just can't tolerate it. I'm going to fire her. Is that okay? And I said, so when's the last time you addressed this with her? And he said, well, I never have, but I have a book And in my book, I have notes from the past 2 years about all the days when I heard her on the phone and she wasn't working, and I wrote it all down. And I said, well, what did she say when you addressed it with her? Well, I haven't. So terrible idea, but all that stuff becomes part of the personnel file. So make sure that you as HR, it's your job to go around and make sure you've got supervision notes, workers' comp, FMLA, all of that stuff that you store separately. And I actually had, there's a case about this too, but I actually had an employer say, well, I keep it all at home, so it's not part of the personnel file. That's just wrong on so many levels, I can't even tell you. One other thing about interviewing internally, if you are promoting somebody from a non-supervisory to a supervisory position, you have to go back and make sure that they have not only your basic sexual harassment training, but the supervisory sexual harassment training, because that statute speaks to training within a year of hire or a year of becoming a supervisor for the supervisor training. So make sure somehow that's on your radar for internal promotions. All right, back to the wheel. Number 12.
Ooh, good thing it wasn't 13.
And I haven't even repeated any of
I
them.
know, it's amazing.
Clarification on FMLA. Can someone take? Why, yes, they can, except what I talked about before, right, with the grandparents. Oh no, well, that's, you still can take both in 1 year, absolutely. But if they're for the same, if they're for reasons covered under state and federal, they're concurrent, right? Anybody have anything to? I mean, that's pretty.
Nope.
Well, is it automatically concurrent, or does the employer still have to take the steps?
You have to designate it. Yeah.
You know,
But I don't think, so let's say it's a medical reason that's covered under both. As long as you get the certification from the DOL, the federal forms, since Maine doesn't have any of its own forms anyway, I don't think you need to separately certify it under Maine law, but I would make sure the person knows
that it's being designated.
it's being designated as both, so that there's no dispute about what they've used and what they haven't used.
And plus the Maine is 10 weeks in 2 years.
Right.
So it may not be every year.
Yes. Documentation in FMLA is probably the most important thing about it. Okay. And I assume that for whoever offered these questions, if we don't answer it completely or you need follow-up, you'll let us know.
We've got 4.
Oh, 4. 14. Can I have a separate policy for Maine employment application? Yes.
So I believe that, yes, you can have a separate policy for earned paid leave and separate vacation time. You probably need to have them coordinated, but you can't have them separately. Can we say that earned paid leave will not be paid upon termination? Yes, you can say that, but you have to keep in mind that if the person's rehired within a year, then their EPL is restored. And if you don't have a separate policy, then accrued EPL will be treated the same as vacation.
But as long as they do, they can go by what their policy
right, if you
says.
have separate policies, they can say separate things.
All right. Good. Anybody have anything? We're all good. Awesome. I think we're going to take this home for the chore chart.
Yeah.
Your chores.
We've already done 6.
We've done 6.
Have we done 6?
I don't remember these.
Bingo.
13. Uh-oh. You said not to
13.
land on that, and look what I did.
All right. I'll say something about this one. Who is a contractor for EEO1 reporting purposes as a CAP agency? Are we a grantee or a contractor? You're a grantee. And incidentally, grantees under the federal are not contractors under the vaccination mandate either. The employers who are required to do the EEO1 filing are, and I refreshed my memory about this a while back, and I gotta admit I was surprised, and I shouldn't have been, but if you have 100 more employees, you just automatically have to file the EEO-1. But if that's really the only basis of your filing it, there is no penalty for not filing it. So it's not exactly one of these hotly enforced things. And then federal government prime contractors or first-tier subcontractors with both 50 or more employees and the contract amounting to $50,000 or more are required to file the EEO-1. And their failure to do so could result in adverse ramifications for your federal contract. But just being a cap agency, in fact, it would be unusual for a cap agency to also be a federal contractor. And I think you know it. So, makes sense?
Glad you're here to answer that. All right, we have at least time for one more, so let's see what we can come up with. I'm not sure how many are left on here anyway.
9?
Number 9, we have 9.
We've already done 9.
Oh, we did? See, what would we do without you?
Oh, no.
14 we already did, didn't we?
Yeah.
What, do you want to just tell us which one we haven't done?
Okay, we haven't done 1.
Your arms are
There we go.
One is
Look, it's on
available.
1.
Okay.
cheating, no.
Please have one to the company. We can change the deductions. I would say so you have to have a writing signed by the employee with very specific information about the terms of repayment. And I think you'd have to have the employee's agreement to change that plan in order to increase the amount before they leave. Don't you guys think?
Yes, different situation once they resign though. Because at that point, then you can withhold loans from the final pay.
From the final pay. But if it
But
doesn't cover
beforehand.
it, you're still ending up trying to recoup it.
Right.
And
You
I
look
guess
like you're
my
gonna complicate
understanding,
things.
probably, but this is not a situation of where the employer accidentally overcompensated the employee.
Right.
So we're not in that the statute we were talking about earlier. This is the statute that permits certain written loans, really, advances to employees.
Right.
Right.
We'd love to restate the obvious.
That's what I'm here for, is the obvious.
I don't know if we answered that or not. I hope we did.